It is the early hours of the 30th of December, 2006. In a former Iraqi intelligence compound on the outskirts of Baghdad, a small group of officials, guards, and witnesses gather in a room lit by harsh fluorescent lights. A man who once ruled over more than 25 million people is led forward, his hands bound, his expression tightly controlled. Outside the building, the city is quiet, sealed off by roadblocks and soldiers. Inside, a camera records what remains of a life that had shaped Iraq for more than 3 decades. Within minutes, Saddam Hussein will be dead. For years, his capture had been regarded as inevitable by some, impossible by others. When American forces pulled him from a narrow underground hiding place near his hometown of Tikrit in December 2003, the image was broadcast repeatedly around the world. It seemed to mark the end of an era, the final collapse of a regime built on fear, surveillance, and absolute control. Yet even in defeat, Saddam remained a figure of fixation, both within Iraq and far beyond it. His trial, his execution, and the legacy he left behind would continue to divide opinion long after his death. To understand how a man could rise from obscurity to become one of the most powerful and feared leaders in the Middle East, it is not enough to examine his final years alone. Saddam Hussein did not emerge fully formed. He was the product of a specific time, a specific place, and a political culture shaped by colonial rule, military coups, and the normalization of violence as a means of governance. His life unfolded alongside the modern Iraqi state itself, and in many ways, the two became inseparable. The Iraq into which Saddam was born was a country still struggling to define itself. Formed little more than a decade earlier from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, it was ruled by a monarchy that derived its authority from British power rather than popular consent. Beneath the surface of formal independence lay deep fractures. Between city and countryside, tribe and state, Sunni and Shia, ruler and ruled. For many Iraqis, particularly in the rural north, the state was distant and unreliable, while personal survival depended on family loyalty and the willingness to use force when necessary. Saddam Hussein entered this world in 1937 in the village of Al-Auja, near Tikrit, a place where poverty was endemic and reputation mattered more than law. His father was absent from his life almost from the beginning, either dead or disappeared before Saddam could remember him. His mother was left isolated and vulnerable, and in time remarried a man whose brutality would leave a lasting impression on the boy. From an early age, Saddam learned that power was something exercised, not inherited, and that those without it endured humiliation. Much of his childhood was spent moving between households, never fully secure, never fully protected. Violence was a constant presence, both inside the home and in the wider society beyond it. Iraq in the 1940s was no stranger to upheaval. Coups, counter-coups, and foreign interference shaped political life, while ordinary people experienced the consequences in the form of instability and repression. For a young boy growing up on the margins, the lesson was clear. Strength ensured survival, and weakness invited suffering. When Saddam was sent to Baghdad as a teenager to live with his uncle, Khairallah Tulfa, his world expanded, but the underlying lesson remained the same. Khairallah was an ardent Arab nationalist who despised British influence and the Iraqi monarchy. He filled Saddam's mind with stories of betrayal, resistance, and the need for decisive action. Under his influence, Saddam encountered politics not as debate or compromise, but as struggle, a contest in which only the ruthless prevailed. By the time Saddam reached adulthood, Iraq was approaching a breaking point. The monarchy's legitimacy was crumbling, radical ideologies were spreading through the cities, and violence was becoming an accepted tool of political change. In this environment, Saddam Hussein did not stand out as an aberration. He was, in many respects, a reflection of the forces reshaping the country itself. The story of Saddam Hussein is not simply the story of a dictator, it is the story of how power is constructed, maintained, and ultimately destroyed in a state born of instability. To understand the man who would rule Iraq with an iron grip, one must first understand the world that made him, and the choices he made within it. By the late 1950s, Iraq was a country moving steadily toward rupture. The monarchy that had ruled since independence was increasingly isolated, propped up by a narrow elite and sustained by a political order that failed to reflect the realities of a rapidly changing society. Oil revenues flowed upward, corruption spread downward, and the gap between the rulers and the ruled widened with each passing year. For young men coming of age in Baghdad, politics no longer appeared as a distant abstraction. It was something immediate, dangerous, and increasingly unavoidable. Saddam Hussein was now in his early 20s. He was poorly educated by elite standards, socially insecure, and intensely ambitious. What he lacked in refinement, he compensated for with discipline and a willingness to embrace violence. Iraq's underground political movements offered men like Saddam a path forward. They promised not only ideological purpose, but also belonging, advancement, and power in a society where conventional routes upward were often blocked. Among these movements, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party held particular appeal. It presented itself as a revolutionary force committed to Arab unity, socialism, and the destruction of foreign influence in the Middle East. Its language was grand and historical, but its methods were conspiratorial and ruthless. Loyalty mattered more than intellect. Action mattered more than theory. For Saddam, this was a natural fit. He formally joined the Ba'ath Party in 1957, a year before Iraq's monarchy would be violently overthrown. At the time, the party was still small and fragmented, operating largely in secret. Members were expected to obey orders without hesitation and to accept that violence was not merely a tactic, but a moral necessity in the struggle for national rebirth. Saddam proved himself eager, dependable, and untroubled by the prospect of bloodshed. These traits did not go unnoticed. In July 1958, a group of military officers led by Abdel-Karim Qasim staged a coup that ended the monarchy and executed the royal family. Iraq was suddenly transformed from a conservative kingdom into a revolutionary republic. For many Iraqis, the coup represented liberation. For others, it marked the beginning of a long period of instability. Qasim quickly consolidated power, sidelining rival factions, including the Ba'athists, whose vision for Iraq differed sharply from his own. The Ba'ath Party soon concluded that Qasim had to be removed. In 1959, Saddam was selected to take part in an assassination attempt against the prime minister. It was a decisive moment in his life. The operation was poorly planned and ultimately failed. Qasim survived with minor injuries, while several of the attackers were killed or captured. Saddam himself was wounded and narrowly escaped, fleeing first to Syria and then to Egypt. Though the assassination attempt failed, it elevated Saddam's standing within Ba'athist circles. He had demonstrated commitment and courage under fire. More importantly, he had crossed a psychological threshold. From this point forward, murder was no longer theoretical. It was something he had attempted personally, in full knowledge of the consequences. Violence was no longer a tool of last resort. It had become a credential. Saddam's years in exile coincided with a period of intense political ferment in the Arab world. In Cairo, he lived under the shadow of Gamal Abdel Nasser's regime, which had become the symbolic center of Arab nationalism. He absorbed its language, its imagery, and its belief in the necessity of authoritarian rule to achieve national goals. Yet Saddam remained an outsider, lacking education and status. He watched, learned, and waited. In 1963, the Ba'ath Party briefly seized power in Iraq through another coup, only to lose it months later amid internal divisions and resistance from the military. Saddam returned to Iraq during this chaotic period and was arrested soon afterward. He spent time in prison, an experience that further reinforced his worldview. Detention did not weaken his commitment, it hardened it. He emerged convinced that hesitation and internal dissent were fatal flaws in revolutionary movements. He escaped from prison in 1966 under circumstances that later became part of Ba'athist lore. The details were embellished over time, but the significance was clear. Saddam had survived, evaded the state, and remained loyal to the party. Within Ba'athist networks, this made him invaluable. He was no longer just an operative, he was a symbol of endurance. As Iraq lurched through coups and counter-coups, Saddam quietly positioned himself as an enforcer rather than a theorist. He did not seek the spotlight. Instead, he cultivated relationships within the party's security apparatus. He understood instinctively that real power lay not in speeches or offices, but in the ability to monitor, intimidate, and eliminate rivals. This insight would define his rise. By the mid-1960s, Saddam was overseeing internal security for the Ba'ath Party, building informal intelligence networks and ensuring loyalty through fear. He kept detailed records on allies and enemies alike. Betrayal, real or imagined, was noted and remembered. In a political culture where trust was scarce, Saddam made himself indispensable by becoming dangerous to cross. In July 1968, the Ba'ath Party seized power once again, this time successfully. The coup was swift and largely bloodless, but what followed was anything but. Saddam Hussein did not emerge as president. That role went to Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, an older relative and military figure who provided a respectable front. Behind the scenes, however, Saddam began constructing something far more durable than a revolutionary government. He moved immediately to secure control over Iraq's internal security services. Arrests followed, interrogations intensified, suspected opponents within the military, the bureaucracy, and even the Ba'ath Party itself were removed. Fear became institutionalized. Loyalty was rewarded. Dissent annihilated. The methods Saddam employed were not improvised. They were systematic, informed by years of observation and personal experience. What distinguished Saddam during this period was not charisma or ideological brilliance, but his capacity for organization and intimidation. He understood that revolutions fail when power is shared too widely. The lesson he had learned from prison, exile, and failed coups was simple. Survival required absolute control over violence. By the end of the 1960s, Saddam Hussein had transformed himself from an obscure village boy into one of the most powerful men in Iraq, though his power remained largely invisible to the public. He didn't yet rule the country, but he was building the machinery through which it would eventually be ruled. The revolution had delivered him to the threshold of authority. What followed would be the careful, methodical conversion of fear into permanent power. When the Ba'ath Party seized power in July 1968, the transition appeared orderly on the surface. Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr assumed the presidency, the Revolutionary Command Council was formed, and official statements promised stability, reform, and Arab unity. To many Iraqis, weary from a decade of coups and counter-coups, the change initially seemed reassuring. Yet behind the public facade, a different process was already underway, one that would determine the true character of the new regime. Saddam Hussein did not take the presidency. He did not need to. Instead, he positioned himself at the heart of the state's coercive apparatus, where power was exercised quietly and relentlessly. As vice chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, he assumed responsibility for internal security, intelligence, and party discipline. These were not peripheral functions. In a system born of conspiracy, they were decisive. The Iraqi state Saddam inherited was fragile. Institutions existed, but loyalty to them was thin. Ministries were riddled with factionalism, the military had a long history of political intervention, and the Ba'ath Party itself was divided by personal rivalries and ideological disputes. Saddam understood that formal authority alone would not hold such a system together. Control had to be enforced, continuously and personally. He began by restructuring Iraq's security services into overlapping organizations that reported directly to him. Intelligence agencies were deliberately kept in competition with one another, ensuring that no single body could challenge his authority. Surveillance expanded rapidly. Party members monitored one another. Files were compiled not only on suspected enemies, but on allies as well. Information became currency, and Saddam ensured that he controlled its flow. Fear was introduced gradually, almost methodically. Early purges were targeted and justified as necessary measures against counter-revolutionaries and foreign agents. Arrests often took place at night. Interrogations were brutal but selective. Public executions were rare in the early years, but rumors spread quickly. The effect was cumulative. People learned to watch their words, to avoid unnecessary attention, and to demonstrate enthusiasm for the regime even when none was required. At the same time, Saddam worked to bind key constituencies to the Ba'athist state through material incentives. Oil revenues, which increased significantly following the nationalization of Iraq's oil industry in the early 1970s, funded expansive social programs. Education and healthcare improved. Infrastructure projects multiplied. For many Iraqis, particularly in urban areas, living standards rose. The regime presented itself as modernizing, efficient, and nationalist, a sharp contrast to the corruption and stagnation of the monarchy. This dual strategy, benefits paired with intimidation, proved highly effective. Those who cooperated were rewarded. Those who resisted disappeared. The boundaries between state, party, and security services blurred, all converging around Saddam himself. Loyalty to him became synonymous with a loyalty to Iraq. Within the Ba'ath Party, Saddam cultivated a culture of absolute obedience. Meetings were carefully staged. Speeches emphasized unity and vigilance against betrayal. Informants were everywhere, though no one knew precisely who they were. This uncertainty was intentional. It discouraged collective opposition and fostered isolation. Potential rivals were neutralized before they could organize. Saddam also demonstrated a keen understanding of symbolism. He encouraged the development of a cult of personality, though initially this was done subtly. Portraits appeared in public buildings. State media praised his dedication and sacrifice. Official narratives highlighted his role in resisting imperialism and defending Iraqi sovereignty. Over time, his image became inseparable from that of the state itself. Behind the scenes, he was ruthless. Senior military officers were dismissed, imprisoned, or executed on suspicion of disloyalty. Former allies within the Ba'ath Party were removed once they had served their purpose. Saddam did not rely on trust. He relied on dependency. Those who rose within the system did so knowing that their fate rested entirely in his hands. By the mid-1970s, Saddam had effectively hollowed out any independent centers of power. The military, once the decisive force in Iraqi politics, was subordinated to the party and infiltrated by intelligence operatives. The judiciary lost autonomy. Civil society was absorbed into state-controlled organizations. Even tribal leaders were co-opted or neutralized through a combination of patronage and threat. Throughout this period, Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr remained president, but his authority steadily diminished. Age and illness weakened him, while Saddam's control over security and information made him indispensable. Decisions increasingly flowed through Saddam, even when they bore al-Bakr's signature. Foreign diplomats began to recognize where real power lay. Externally, Iraq pursued a pragmatic foreign policy. It cultivated relations with both the Soviet Union and Western powers, presenting itself as a stable, secular counterweight to regional instability. Saddam played a central role in these efforts, projecting confidence and discipline. To outsiders, Iraq appeared strong, coherent, and predictable. Internally, however, the price of this stability was mounting. Torture became routine within detention centers. Political prisons filled with suspected dissidents. Entire families could be punished for the actions of one member. Silence became a survival strategy. The state no longer merely governed, it watched. By 1977, Saddam was ready for the final step. The remaining obstacles were symbolic rather than structural. In July 1979, Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr resigned, officially citing health reasons. Saddam Hussein assumed the presidency, along with control of the Revolutionary Command Council, the Ba'ath Party, and the armed forces. The transition was swift and seamless. Within days, Saddam convened a party meeting that would define the new era. Senior Baathists were accused of treason in a carefully choreographed purge. Confessions were read aloud. Names were called. Those identified as conspirators were removed from the room and later executed. Others were compelled to demonstrate loyalty by participating in the killings themselves. It was a public lesson, broadcast nationwide. The message was unmistakable. Saddam Hussein now ruled Iraq alone. Power was no longer contested, shared, or concealed. It was centralized, absolute, and enforced through fear. What he had built over the previous decade was not merely a government, but a system. A machinery of power designed to sustain itself through intimidation, surveillance, and controlled reward. It was efficient, disciplined, and profoundly violent, and it was only just beginning. Saddam Hussein's assumption of the presidency in July 1979 marked not merely a change of leadership, but a fundamental transformation of the Iraqi state. The careful balance of factions, personalities, and institutions that had characterized Ba'athist rule during the previous decade was swept aside. What replaced it was a system centered entirely on one man. Saddam did not share power. He absorbed it. The purge that followed his elevation was swift and theatrical. Senior members of the Ba'ath Party were summoned to a special conference in Baghdad, ostensibly to celebrate the party's achievements. Instead, the meeting became a stage-managed demonstration of terror. One by one, alleged conspirators were named, accused of treason, and removed from the hall. Many were executed shortly afterward. Others were forced to participate in the killings themselves, binding them to the regime through shared guilt. The event was broadcast on state television. Its purpose was not secrecy, but intimidation. In the weeks that followed, Saddam moved methodically to eliminate any remaining ambiguity about his authority. Key positions across the military, intelligence services, and party apparatus were filled with loyalists, many of them from his home region around Tikrit. Family ties, tribal connections, and personal loyalty replaced ideology as the primary currency of advancement. Competence mattered less than obedience. Survival depended on proximity to Saddam and unquestioning submission to his will. At the same time, Saddam intensified efforts to cultivate a cult of personality on a scale Iraq had never witnessed. His image appeared everywhere, on walls, in classrooms, in government offices. State media portrayed him as the embodiment of Iraqi history and Arab destiny, a leader of rare insight and strength. Speeches were carefully scripted and widely disseminated. His words became doctrine. To question them was to question the state itself. The consolidation of absolute power coincided with a moment of extraordinary confidence. Iraq's oil wealth was at its peak. Revenues funded ambitious development projects, expanded social services, and a massive military buildup. Baghdad was transformed by new infrastructure, modern buildings, and grand monuments celebrating national pride. For many Iraqis, the early years of Saddam's rule were associated with stability, order, and material improvement. Yet beneath the surface, the regime's reliance on fear deepened. Surveillance expanded further. Neighbors informed on one another. Children were encouraged to report disloyal comments made at home. The security services operated with near total impunity. Arrests no longer required justification beyond suspicion. Torture was systematic, designed not only to extract information but to break individuals psychologically. Saddam's personal paranoia intensified as his power grew. He rarely slept in the same place twice in a row. He surrounded himself with multiple security rings and relied increasingly on family members to protect him. Trust was a liability. Even long-serving allies were viewed with suspicion. The lessons Saddam had learned throughout his life, that betrayal was inevitable, now governed the state. Foreign policy during this period reflected both confidence and calculation. Saddam positioned Iraq as a leading Arab power, asserting independence from both superpower blocs, while maintaining pragmatic relationships with each. He presented himself as a bulwark against revolutionary Iran, which had overthrown the Shah in 1979 and established an Islamic republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. The ideological contrast between Iraq's secular Baathism and Iran's Shia theocracy sharpened regional tensions. Domestically, Saddam sought to unify the country under a singular national identity, but this effort was selective. While public rhetoric emphasized Arab unity, minorities were increasingly marginalized. Kurdish aspirations for autonomy in the north were met with repression. Political Shia movements were closely monitored and suppressed. Loyalty to Saddam superseded all other identities. The regime's effectiveness lay in its ability to present order while institutionalizing violence. There were no spontaneous purges, no chaotic bloodletting. Everything was organized, recorded, and rationalized. Fear became bureaucratic. Files replaced accusations. Decisions were formalized, even when they resulted in execution. By 1980, Saddam Hussein appeared unassailable. He controlled the state, the party, the military, and the economy. Dissent had been crushed or driven underground. His authority was absolute, and his confidence reflected it. He had achieved what he had sought since his youth, total dominance over his environment. Yet this concentration of power carried an inherent risk. The system Saddam had built left no room for correction, no mechanism for dissent, and no margin for error. Every decision, every gamble, rested on his judgment alone. The regime's strength was also its vulnerability. As tensions with Iran escalated, Saddam began to see himself not merely as Iraq's ruler, but as the defender of the Arab world against a revolutionary threat. The logic of absolute power now pushed him toward confrontation. War, in his mind, was not a danger but an opportunity, an instrument through which to consolidate authority further and secure his place in history. The machinery of power was complete. The stage was set. What followed would test not only Saddam Hussein's ambitions, but the limits of fear as a foundation for rule. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein made the most consequential decision of his life. Iraqi forces crossed the border into Iran, initiating a conflict that Saddam believed would be swift, decisive, and transformative. To him, the war promised everything he valued: regional dominance, internal unity, and historical legitimacy. Instead, it would consume 8 years, devastate 2 nations, and lock his regime into a cycle of violence from which it would never fully escape. The context seemed favorable. Iran was in turmoil following the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Its military leadership had been purged, its institutions destabilized, and its relations with the outside world severely damaged. Saddam calculated that Iran was weak, divided, and vulnerable. He also feared the spread of revolutionary Shia ideology into Iraq, where the majority of the population was Shia but ruled by a Sunni-dominated regime. War, he believed, would neutralize this threat. The invasion was framed domestically as a defensive action, a necessary response to Iranian provocations. State media portrayed Saddam as a protector of Arab identity against Persian expansionism. Early advances reinforced his confidence. Iraqi forces captured territory along the border, and Saddam declared that Iran would soon sue for peace. It did not. Instead, Iran mobilized its population with extraordinary resolve. The war rapidly escalated into a grinding stalemate, defined by trench warfare, mass infantry assaults, and staggering casualties. What Saddam had envisioned as a short campaign became an existential struggle. Yet retreat was unthinkable. To withdraw would signal weakness. To compromise would undermine the mythology he had constructed around his leadership. As the war dragged on, Saddam's grip on power tightened further. Emergency measures became permanent. Military courts proliferated. Desertion was punished with execution. Families of accused traitors were subjected to collective punishment. The logic of total war merged seamlessly with the logic of total control. Internationally, Saddam found himself in an unusual position. Though officially non-aligned, Iraq received substantial support from both Western and Eastern blocs. The United States, European powers, and several Arab states viewed Saddam's Iraq as a necessary counterweight to revolutionary Iran. Financial aid, intelligence sharing, and military equipment flowed into Baghdad. The war was brutal, but Saddam was not isolated. This external backing reinforced his belief that he was indispensable. He interpreted support not as conditional or pragmatic, but as validation of his role as a regional strongman. It encouraged escalation. When conventional warfare failed to break Iranian resistance, Saddam authorized the use of chemical weapons, first against Iranian troops, then against Iraq's own Kurdish population. The attack on the Kurdish town of Halabja in March 1988 became the most infamous of these episodes. Chemical agents killed thousands of civilians, leaving images that would later shock the world. At the time, international response was muted. Strategic interests outweighed humanitarian outrage. Saddam took note. Within Iraq, the war reshaped society. Entire generations were mobilized. Economic priorities shifted toward survival. Oil revenues declined and debt mounted. Yet the regime maintained an image of resilience. Saddam appeared frequently in uniform, visiting front lines, projecting confidence. The cult of personality intensified, presenting him as both warrior and guardian. Psychologically, the war reinforced Saddam's most destructive instincts. Surrounded by yes men and insulated from dissent, he interpreted survival as vindication. Every failed prediction was reframed as endurance. Every catastrophe was attributed to betrayal or foreign conspiracy. Responsibility narrowed inward, concentrating further around his own judgment. By 1988, both Iraq and Iran were exhausted. The war ended not in victory, but in ceasefire. Borders remained largely unchanged. Casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Saddam emerged claiming triumph, though the reality was far more ambiguous. Iraq was financially strained, socially scarred, and militarized to an unprecedented degree. Yet Saddam's self-perception was unchanged. He had survived. In his worldview, survival equaled success. The regime had endured the longest conventional war of the 20th century, and he remained in power. To Saddam, this was proof of strength. What he failed to fully grasp was the cost. The war had entrenched militarism, normalized mass violence, and deepened Iraq's economic dependency. It had also reinforced Saddam's belief that risk-taking, backed by force and intimidation, would always be rewarded. This miscalculation would soon prove fatal. As the guns fell silent along the Iranian border, Saddam turned his attention elsewhere. Iraq was burdened by debt, its economy strained, its population weary. Rather than retrench, Saddam looked outward again, convinced that decisive action could solve problems that compromise could not. The habits formed during 8 years of war, escalation, denial, and absolute confidence would shape his next move. And this time, the consequences would extend far beyond the region. When the Iran-Iraq War ended in August 1988, Saddam Hussein emerged exhausted but unbroken. He presented the ceasefire as a victory, declaring that Iraq had defended the Arab world against revolutionary Iran and preserved regional stability. State media echoed this narrative relentlessly. Parades were held, medals were awarded, and monuments erected. Yet beneath the triumphalist language lay a far more precarious reality. Iraq was deeply indebted. Years of total war had drained its treasury, leaving it owing tens of billions of dollars to foreign creditors, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Oil revenues, once abundant, were insufficient to cover reconstruction and military maintenance. Saddam believed that Iraq's sacrifices entitled it to relief. When this relief did not come, resentment grew. Relations with Kuwait deteriorated rapidly. Saddam accused the Kuwaiti government of overproducing oil and driving down prices, thereby undermining Iraq's economy. He also revived long-standing territorial claims, arguing that Kuwait had historically been part of Iraq and had been artificially separated under British colonial rule. These arguments were not new, but they took on new urgency in the context of Iraq's post-war desperation. Throughout 1990, Saddam tested international reaction through rhetoric and military posturing. He believed that his strategic importance during the war with Iran had secured him a degree of immunity. The signals he received were ambiguous. Diplomatic communications failed to deter him decisively. Saddam interpreted this ambiguity as tacit acceptance. In August 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. The operation was swift. Within days, the country was occupied and declared Iraq's 19th province. Saddam framed the invasion as an act of justice, a correction of historical wrongs, and a necessary step to secure Iraq's economic future. Internally, dissent was suppressed. Externally, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time since Saddam had consolidated power, he faced unified international opposition. The United Nations condemned the invasion. Sanctions were imposed. A US-led coalition began assembling with unprecedented speed. Iraq's former allies turned against it. The strategic logic that had guided Saddam for decades collapsed almost overnight. Saddam responded with defiance. He believed that the coalition lacked the will to fight a protracted war. He expected internal divisions to emerge among Arab states. He also believed that Israel might be drawn into the conflict, fracturing the alliance. None of these assumptions proved correct. Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991 with a massive aerial bombardment. Iraqi infrastructure was devastated. Command and control systems collapsed. The Republican Guard, Saddam's elite force, suffered heavy losses. After weeks of airstrikes, coalition ground forces advanced rapidly, overwhelming Iraqi positions. The war lasted mere weeks. The defeat was decisive. Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait. The myth of invincibility Saddam had cultivated was shattered. Yet, remarkably, his regime survived. Coalition forces halted their advance short of Baghdad, leaving Saddam in power. This outcome reinforced one of Saddam's most dangerous beliefs, that endurance, not victory, was what mattered. In the aftermath, Iraq erupted. Shia uprisings in the south and Kurdish rebellions in the north threatened the regime. Saddam responded with brutal repression. Helicopter gunships, mass arrests, and executions crushed dissent. Once again, violence restored control. Sanctions tightened. Iraq was isolated economically and diplomatically. Living standards collapsed. Infrastructure deteriorated. Malnutrition spread. Yet Saddam's inner circle remained insulated. Resources were diverted toward regime survival, not public welfare. The suffering of the population became a tool of defiance, framed as evidence of foreign cruelty. Throughout this period, Saddam oscillated between confrontation and calculation. He allowed limited cooperation with weapons inspectors while obstructing them at critical moments. He sought to project strength while managing decline. His worldview, shaped by decades of survival through intimidation, left little room for adaptation. The Gulf War marked the turning point. Saddam Hussein was no longer a rising regional power. He was a besieged ruler, isolated yet defiant, ruling over a country hollowed out by war and sanctions. The world had turned against him, but he remained in place. What followed would be a long, corrosive standoff, one that would erode Iraq from within and gradually narrow the distance between Saddam Hussein and his final reckoning. When the Iran-Iraq War ended in August 1988, Saddam Hussein emerged exhausted but unbroken. He presented the ceasefire as a victory, declaring that Iraq had defended the Arab world against revolutionary Iran and preserved regional stability. State media echoed this narrative relentlessly. Parades were held, medals were awarded, and monuments erected. Yet beneath the triumphalist language lay a far more precarious reality. Iraq was deeply indebted. Years of total war had drained its treasury, leaving it owing tens of billions of dollars to foreign creditors, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Oil revenues, once abundant, were insufficient to cover reconstruction and military maintenance. Saddam believed that Iraq's sacrifices entitled it to relief. When this relief did not come, resentment grew. Relations with Kuwait deteriorated rapidly. Saddam accused the Kuwaiti government of overproducing oil and driving down prices, thereby undermining Iraq's economy. He also revived long-standing territorial claims, arguing that Kuwait had historically been part of Iraq and had been artificially separated under British colonial rule. These arguments were not new, but they took on new urgency in the context of Iraq's post-war desperation. Throughout 1990, Saddam tested international reaction through rhetoric and military posturing. He believed that his strategic importance during the war with Iran had secured him a degree of immunity. The signals he received were ambiguous. Diplomatic communications failed to deter him decisively. Saddam interpreted this ambiguity as tacit acceptance. In August 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. The operation was swift. Within days, the country was occupied and declared Iraq's 19th province. Saddam framed the invasion as an act of justice, a correction of historical wrongs, and a necessary step to secure Iraq's economic future. Internally, dissent was suppressed. Externally, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time since Saddam had consolidated power, he faced unified international opposition. The United Nations condemned the invasion. Sanctions were imposed. A US-led coalition began assembling with unprecedented speed. Iraq's former allies turned against it. The strategic logic that had guided Saddam for decades collapsed almost overnight. Saddam responded with defiance. He believed that the coalition lacked the will to fight a protracted war. He expected internal divisions to emerge among Arab states. He also believed that Israel might be drawn into the conflict, fracturing the alliance. None of these assumptions proved correct. Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991 with a massive aerial bombardment. Iraqi infrastructure was devastated. Command and control systems collapsed. The Republican Guard, Saddam's elite force, suffered heavy losses. After weeks of airstrikes, coalition ground forces advanced rapidly, overwhelming Iraqi positions. The war lasted mere weeks. The defeat was decisive. Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait. The myth of invincibility Saddam had cultivated was shattered. Yet, remarkably, his regime survived. Coalition forces halted their advance short of Baghdad, leaving Saddam in power. This outcome reinforced one of Saddam's most dangerous beliefs, that endurance, not victory, was what mattered. In the aftermath, Iraq erupted. Shia uprisings in the south and Kurdish rebellions in the north threatened the regime. Saddam responded with brutal repression. Helicopter gunships, mass arrests, and executions crushed dissent. Once again, violence restored control. Sanctions tightened. Iraq was isolated economically and diplomatically. Living standards collapsed. Infrastructure deteriorated. Malnutrition spread. Yet Saddam's inner circle remained insulated. Resources were diverted toward regime survival, not public welfare. The suffering of the population became a tool of defiance, framed as evidence of foreign cruelty. Throughout this period, Saddam oscillated between confrontation and calculation. He allowed limited cooperation with weapons inspectors while obstructing them at critical moments. He sought to project strength while managing decline. His worldview, shaped by decades of survival through intimidation, left little room for adaptation. The Gulf War marked the turning point. Saddam Hussein was no longer a rising regional power. He was a besieged ruler, isolated yet defiant, ruling over a country hollowed out by war and sanctions. The world had turned against him, but he remained in place. What followed would be a long, corrosive standoff, one that would erode Iraq from within and gradually narrow the distance between Saddam Hussein and his final reckoning. The attacks of September 11, 2001, transformed the geopolitical environment. Though Iraq was not directly involved, the global shift toward preemptive security doctrines narrowed Saddam's margin for maneuver. His regime was now viewed through a lens of threat rather than containment. Inside Iraq, the state was hollow. Institutions functioned only to the extent that they served regime survival. The military was weakened, infrastructure was degraded, public trust was absent. Saddam's authority remained intact, but it rested on habit, fear, and inertia, rather than confidence or legitimacy. As the prospect of invasion grew, Saddam misjudged the balance again. He assumed that international divisions would prevent decisive action. He believed that displays of defiance enhanced deterrence. He underestimated the extent to which his regime had become isolated, distrusted, and expendable. In March 2003, coalition forces invaded Iraq. The regime collapsed with stunning speed. Baghdad fell within weeks. Saddam disappeared from public view, issuing occasional audio messages that echoed a past era of certainty and command. The state he had dominated for nearly a quarter century dissolved almost overnight. His capture later that year, hiding in a small underground shelter near Tikrit, symbolized the end of the illusion. The man who had ruled through omnipresent fear was now alone, powerless, and exposed. What remained was reckoning. In December 2003, 9 months after the invasion of Iraq, American forces located Saddam Hussein near his hometown of Tikrit. He was found hiding in a narrow underground shelter, concealed beneath a farmhouse, disheveled and unarmed. The images that followed, Saddam being examined by a military doctor, his mouth searched, his hair unkempt, were broadcast repeatedly around the world. For many, they were shocking not because of their brutality, but because of their ordinariness. The man who had once dominated Iraq through spectacle and terror now appeared diminished, almost anonymous. Yet capture did not resolve the question that had defined Saddam's life. How would power judge one of its own? Saddam was transferred to custody and held at a secure facility. For the first time in decades, he was cut off entirely from the machinery of control that had sustained him. There were no intelligence files, no informants, no loyal guards whose fortunes depended on his survival. What remained was the individual, stripped of authority, forced to confront the consequences of decisions once insulated by fear. The Iraqi Special Tribunal was established to prosecute him for crimes committed during his rule. The trial focused initially on the 1982 killings of Shia villagers in Dujail, a relatively narrow case chosen for its evidentiary clarity. Even so, the proceedings were fraught. Judges were intimidated or assassinated. Defense lawyers were killed. The courtroom itself became an extension of Iraq's unresolved conflict. Saddam used the trial not to seek leniency, but to reassert relevance. He rejected the court's legitimacy, denounced the occupation, and portrayed himself as the rightful president of Iraq. At times defiant, at times theatrical, he remained consistent in one respect. He never expressed remorse. To do so would have contradicted the worldview that had sustained him since youth, that force defined morality and survival validated action. In November 2006, Saddam was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on the 30th of December the same year. The execution was hurried, conducted amid political pressure and sectarian tension. Mobile phone footage later leaked, showing taunts exchanged in the execution chamber. The scene was chaotic, stripped of solemnity. With his death, Saddam Hussein passed from power into history. Yet his execution did not bring closure. Iraq did not stabilize. Violence escalated. Sectarian conflict intensified. The state Saddam had ruled collapsed more thoroughly after his removal than it ever had under his control. Institutions he had hollowed out proved incapable of sustaining order. The fear he had used as glue dissolved, leaving fragmentation behind. This outcome complicates any assessment of Saddam's legacy. He was unquestionably responsible for immense suffering, wars that killed hundreds of thousands, repression that crushed dissent, and policies that destroyed entire communities. At the same time, his fall exposed how deeply Iraq's stability had been tied to coercion rather than consent. The order he imposed was real, but it was brittle. Saddam did not create Iraq's divisions, but he exploited them. He did not invent authoritarianism in the Middle East, but he refined its mechanisms with exceptional discipline. His genius, if it can be called that, lay not in ideology or vision, but in control. Control of information, of violence, of fear. For decades it worked. His life illustrates a central paradox of power. Absolute authority can produce stability, but it does so by eliminating the very structures that allow a society to function without fear. When such a system collapses, it leaves little behind. In the end, Saddam Hussein's story is not simply that of a dictator brought to justice. It is the story of how violence becomes normalized, how institutions are replaced by loyalty, and how a state can come to depend on a single individual to such an extent that his removal becomes catastrophic. Whether Saddam was inevitable, a product of Iraq's history and geography, or whether his rise was contingent on a series of choices remains an open question. What is clear is that once he seized power, he shaped Iraq irrevocably, and Iraq in turn shaped him. The man who once sought to define Iraq's destiny ultimately could not control his own end. But the consequences of his rule didn't die with him. They continued, embedded in the fractures he left behind. And that may be the most enduring legacy of all.